Hey there, my name's Brashler, and in this video, I want to show you how to get Waves SuperRack Performer on your computer interfaced with an analog console utilizing the Midas DN4816i, the Midas DN4816-O, and the Midas DN4816-U. Now, if you're brand new to my channel, I'm all about helping you feel more confident with your production gear no matter where you're starting from. So let's go ahead and dive in. Now, the production quality of this video is gonna be a little bit smaller because this is a very simple setup. Utilizing the Klark Teknik DN4816-U, which allows us to convert StageConnect to USB, will allow us to interface our Mac or PC with Waves SuperRack Performer, which a lot of you know is a great way of utilizing Waves plugins live without a SoundGrid setup. Now, Waves SuperRack Performer utilizes the CPU of your computer for all of the audio processing. So there's a slight amount of latency that's added by utilizing a normal computer like this. The other way of doing it is with a SoundGrid network, in which case you can get very, very, very fast latency. But the measured latency of utilizing this setup with the DN4816-U and the DN4816i and O, giving you a total of 16 inputs and 16 outputs on Waves SuperRack Performer, is a total of 7.77 milliseconds of latency from the input to the output. So that's honestly pretty fast. That's about roughly the time that it takes sound to travel about 7 to 8 feet. So honestly, that is extremely fast. Now, if you're utilizing in-ears with this, then some of your picky musicians might be able to hear that amount of latency. Now, most musicians and most people can't really tell the latency until it gets above 10 milliseconds. So you just need to keep that in mind with the amount of plugins that you add inside of Waves SuperRack Performer. Because if you utilize some plugins that do add latency, that will add up on top of that 7.77 milliseconds of latency. So just keep that in mind while you are setting up your system. Now, the way to set this up is you grab a USB cable from your computer and you plug that into the DN4816-U. And then at this point, we just need to apply power to this. Now that we have our USB connected between our DN4816-U and our computer, all we have to do is add our power to this unit. So we can just go ahead and add power. Now, this DN4816-U has a couple of options here on the back of the unit. So by default, when you power this thing up and connect it to your computer the first time, it is already set up in 16 by 16, meaning that there's 16 inputs and 16 outputs over StageConnect on your USB cable to your computer, which is great because that's the setting that we want to have it set up as. Now, StageConnect allows you to send all the way up to 40 meters in length between your first device and your last device. Now, when you're utilizing a longer distance like that, it does need to be a 110 ohm style cable. So AES EBU cables or DMX cables. Now, it is a standard 3-pin XLR, so as long as you're grabbing a 3-pin XLR or an AES EBU cable, you can utilize all the way up to 40 meters in length. Now, if you want to go farther than that, then Behringer actually just released an SCRE, which is a StageConnect range extender. Now, this is a brand new product that's not really out yet, but at some point it'll hit the markets, in which case you would then be able to extend that distance of StageConnect instead of 40 meters all the way up to 80 meters in length, which is very far. Now, StageConnect sends 32 channels in total at 24-bit at 48 kilohertz. So 32 channels in total is perfect because we need 16 in and 16 out, which is what this works as. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to connect a cable from the master output of this to our first StageConnect device, which in this case is going to be my DN4816i. So all we have to do is grab a cable and connect it from the master port to the slave port on the DN4816i, just like so. Next, there is this switch over on the right-hand side of the back of the unit. We need to make sure that this is in slave mode and not master. The other thing that we need to do is make sure that this switch is set to 16 by 16. And at this point, this unit is working. So we have a blue power light and then a green StageConnect, which is a good thing. Now, the next thing that we need to do is route a cable from our master port here to the slave port of the DN4816 O, which is the 16-channel output version of this series. Now, another thing I want to mention is if you are keeping this at front of house and these runs are very small, then you can utilize just normal XLR. It doesn't have to be that 110 ohm DMX cable unless you're doing very long runs, getting up to that 40 meters in length total from the first device to the last device. But since this is just in my studio, I'm using normal XLR, so I don't really need to worry about anything. So on the back here, I'm going to connect my cable from the master to the slave port of the second unit. Now, at this point, with StageConnect, we're able to power one device from the original device in the chain. There's not enough power in the StageConnect network to be able to connect power for two devices. So I will need to add power to one of these two devices. So I can either choose the top one or the bottom one for adding power. And then once I do that, then it will start rescanning the StageConnect network and working. So here we have my power cable, and I'm going to connect in power to the bottom unit, in which case we can now see that there is blue power on both units, and on the right side, these are both green. Now, if one of them comes up red and the other one is green, then all you need to do is disconnect the cable from your DN4816U and just re-power cycle everything, in which case both of them would come up green. Now, if you do happen to have an issue where it is not coming up correctly, then just make sure that your switches are set to both being slave on both the top unit and the bottom unit, and that the top unit is in 16:16 mode, and then the bottom unit, the output mode, can either be individual or shared. It actually doesn't really matter with this configured setup. So the next thing that we need to do is we just need to go over to our computer and run some SuperRack Performer. Now that I have Waves SuperRack Performer open, I want to go to Setup and then to Audio Setup. Now this is where we actually select what our audio interface is for Waves SuperRack Performer, in which case I'm going to go to my device and go find my DN4816U. And at this point, we can then set our sample rate, which is hard-coded at 48 kilohertz, which is just fine. And then we can set our buffer size. Now, if you are utilizing a computer that is running a lot of processes, then you are going to need to select a higher buffer size, which means more latency. If you have a computer dedicated just to Waves SuperRack Performer, and it is a powerful computer as far as the CPU goes, in which case you can select a smaller buffer size, which has less latency. So in this case, I'm going to select the lowest amount of latency first, because I can then test with some plugins to see if I get any pops and crackles. Now, if you do happen to start getting some pops and crackles, you need to make sure that the only thing running on your computer is Waves SuperRack Performer. If you're trying to use a stream of OBS and a bunch of other things on your computer, you'll want to make sure that this computer is just dedicated strictly for Waves SuperRack Performer. Now, if you do still have some pops and drops or clicks, then you'll want to select a higher buffer size. And that's going to introduce a little bit more latency. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and select 32 for my buffer size, and then we can go ahead and jump back over to our overview, which will then show us our racks that we have available to us on SuperRack Performer. Now at this point, we can start routing our audio inputs and outputs to our racks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my inputs 1, 2 as mono, and then 3 and 4 is actually going to be a stereo pair. So let me show that to you. So on rack 1, I'm going to go to my input, select mono, go to my DN4816U, and select input 1. Now automatically, this is going to route the output at the same time. And then on rack 2, we'll do the same thing. Mono, input 2. Now on rack 3, I want to make this a stereo setup, because maybe this is an insert for, say, a reverb send or a stereo keyboard, that sort of thing. So I want to make sure that this rack is stereo. So on input, I'm going to go down to stereo and then DN4816U and select input 3 and 4. And that will automatically route the output as well. Now at this point, this is when we either need to put this as part of our studio patch bay or start actually routing our inputs and outputs directly to this. Now remember, input 1 and output 1 are paired, and input 2 and output 2 are paired, and then 3 and 4 is a stereo pair. So at this point, if I just plug in some inputs, I will start seeing them in Waves SuperRack Performer. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in input 1. So now I have my input going into the top and the output going into the bottom. Now over in Waves SuperRack Performer, we can see that I actually have noise being generated into my input 1 on my rack 1 and then being outputted back out of this unit. Now the great thing is this gives us 16 channels of line level inputs and outputs that you can utilize with really any pieces of gear that you want to. So you can utilize this with an analog console or a tracking console or a mixing console that's all analog. And what's great is because it's line level, you're not really going to be introducing extra noise. Now, as far as latency goes, my current latency between taking an input into the top and then all the way through SuperRack Performer to then the output and then back to my console, that actual latency currently is 7.54 milliseconds. Now, that is with a buffer size of 32. Now, if I go to my setup and I go change my buffer size to say 128, then at that point, this latency is actually going to change, which we can see Open Sound Meter is making an adjustment over here. And now by running a buffer of 128, my total round trip latency through this system to Waves and back is going to be 11.4 milliseconds. So again, we're around 10 milliseconds of latency. Now, if you take it very high, so this would be if you were mixing broadcast and you had a lot of latency that you were able to have because video is always more latent than audio, then we can actually run a higher buffer size, giving more processor power to your computer, enabling you to have more plugins on your computer without running as high of a CPU usage. So, for instance, if I go to setup and I change my buffer size to then be 1024, then our total round trip latency from the input to the output all the way through Waves is now 48.73 milliseconds, which really isn't that bad considering most video systems have about 66 to 88 milliseconds of latency that we need to account for as far as mixing audio to be in time with our sync for video. Now, utilizing this setup is pretty easy. We have our DN4816i, we have our DN4816O, we have a couple cables to get them all connected, and then we have the DN4816U, and then of course, Waves SuperRack Performer on our computer. Now, you can run this on both Mac because it is core audio, or you can run it on PC as long as you download and install the driver for the DN4816U. Now, I hope this video was helpful for you today. If you do happen to have any questions or there's a video that you're hoping that I would make, really on anything, please post that in the comment section down below, as I'm always reading through those comments to find videos that are gonna be helpful for you. If you haven't already, make sure to check out my website at drewbrashler.com, where I have a whole bunch of articles, tips, and tricks on really audio in general. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day.